Caesar then demanded the same terms he had given to the envoys: that Ariovistus neither wage war on the Aedui nor their allies, return the hostages, and, if he could not send any part of the Germans back home, at least prevent any more from crossing the Rhine. Ariovistus replied briefly to Caesar's demands, but spoke at length about his own merits. He stated that he had crossed the Rhine not by his own will, but at the request and invitation of the Gauls, having left home and family with great hopes and rewards. He had been given land in Gaul by the Gauls themselves, received hostages by their own will, and was taking tribute by the right of war, which victors usually impose on the vanquished. He argued that it was the Gauls who had waged war on him, not the other way around, as all the states of Gaul had come to attack him and camped against him. He had defeated them all in a single battle. If they wanted to try again, he was ready to fight. If they wanted peace, it was unjust to refuse the tribute they had voluntarily paid up to that point. He stated that the friendship of the Roman people should be an honor and protection, not a detriment, and he had sought it with this expectation. If the Romans wanted to relieve him of the tribute and the surrendered peoples, he would gladly renounce the Roman people's friendship as he had sought it. He said he was bringing more Germans into Gaul to protect himself, not to attack Gaul, and he had only come at the Gauls' request and had defended himself, not initiated the war. He claimed he had arrived in Gaul before the Romans and had never seen a Roman army in Gaul before this. What did Caesar want? Why was he coming into his possessions? Gaul was his province, just as Rome had theirs. He argued that just as it would be unfair for him to invade Roman territory, it was equally unfair for the Romans to interfere with his rights. He scoffed at the Aedui being called brothers by the Senate, stating that they neither helped the Romans in the last war with the Allobroges nor received assistance from the Romans in their conflicts with the Sequani. He suspected Caesar of having an army in Gaul to crush him under the guise of friendship. He warned that if Caesar did not withdraw his army from these regions, he would consider him an enemy, not a friend. He added that killing Caesar would earn him great favor from many Roman nobles and leaders, whose goodwill and friendship he could secure with Caesar's death. However, if Caesar left and handed Gaul over to him, he would reward him richly and undertake any wars Caesar wanted without any effort or risk on Caesar's part. Many arguments were made by Caesar to show why he could not abandon the undertaking. Neither his nor the Roman people's custom allowed for abandoning allies who had served them well. Nor did he believe that Gaul should belong to Ariovistus rather than the Roman people. The Arverni and the Ruteni had been conquered in war by Quintus Fabius Maximus, but the Roman people had pardoned them, neither incorporating them into the province nor imposing a tribute. If the most ancient times were to be considered, the Roman people had the most justified claim to rule in Gaul. If the judgment of the Senate was to be respected, Gaul ought to be free, as the Senate had declared it free to use its own laws after it was conquered in war. While these matters were being discussed in the meeting, Caesar was informed that Ariovistus's cavalry was approaching the hill and riding up to his men, throwing stones and weapons at them. Caesar immediately ended the meeting and returned to his men, ordering them not to retaliate in any way against the enemy. Although he saw that a battle between his selected legion and the cavalry would have involved no danger, he did not want it to be said that the enemy had been ambushed under the pretext of a conference. After it became known among the soldiers how arrogantly Ariovistus had behaved during the conference, forbidding all of Gaul to the Romans, and how his cavalry had attacked Caesar's men and disrupted the meeting, the soldiers were filled with much greater eagerness and enthusiasm for fighting. 2 days later, Ariovistus sent envoys to Caesar, stating that he wished to discuss the matters that had been started but not completed between them. He proposed either setting another date for a meeting or, if Caesar preferred, sending one of his own legates to him. Caesar saw no reason for another meeting, especially since the Germans had been unable to restrain themselves from throwing weapons at his men the day before. He believed that sending one of his own men to Ariovistus would be too dangerous and expose them to wild and savage people. He thought it best to send Gaius Valerius Procillus, the son of Gaius Valerius Caparus, a young man of great courage and character. whose father had been granted Roman citizenship by Gaius Valerius Flaccus, and who was fluent in the Gallic language, which Ariovistus used frequently. There was no reason for the Germans to harm Procillus, and he sent Marcus Medius, who was a guest of Ariovistus, along with him. He instructed them to find out what Ariovistus wanted and report back to him. When Ariovistus saw them in his camp, he shouted in front of his army, asking why they had come, whether it was to spy on him. He did not allow them to speak and threw them in chains. On the same day, Ariovistus moved his camp and set up 6 miles from Caesar's camp at the foot of a mountain. The next day, he led his forces past Caesar's camp and set up camp 2 miles beyond it, intending to cut Caesar off from supplies and provisions coming from the Sequani and Aedui. From that day on, Caesar led his troops out of the camp daily, forming them into a battle line, offering Ariovistus the opportunity to fight if he wished. Ariovistus, however, kept his army in the camp for several days, engaging only in cavalry skirmishes each day. The type of combat the Germans practiced was this. There were 6,000 cavalry, and an equal number of the fastest and bravest foot soldiers, each selected by one of the cavalry for their protection. These foot soldiers fought among the cavalry, and the horsemen would retreat to them if needed. If any horseman was wounded or fell, they would surround and protect him. If they needed to advance further or retreat quickly, these foot soldiers, holding on to the horses' manes, could match the horses' speed. When Caesar saw that Ariovistus was keeping to his camp to avoid being cut off from supplies for too long, he moved his camp past Ariovistus's position, about 600 paces away, and chose a suitable place for a new camp. He formed his army into 3 lines, with the first and second lines ready to fight, and ordered the third line to fortify the camp. Ariovistus sent about 16,000 light-armed soldiers and all his cavalry to scare Caesar's men and prevent them from fortifying the camp. Nevertheless, Caesar continued with his plan, ordering the first 2 lines to repel the enemy and the third to complete the fortifications. After fortifying the camp, he left 2 legions and part of the auxiliaries there and took the remaining 4 legions back to the main camp. The next day, following his usual practice, Caesar led his troops out of both camps and drew them up a short distance from the main camp, offering the enemy battle. When he saw that they did not come out even then, he led his army back to camp around noon. Ariovistus then sent part of his forces to attack the smaller camp. A fierce battle was fought until evening, with many wounds inflicted and received on both sides. At sunset, Ariovistus withdrew his troops to camp. When Caesar questioned the captives about why Ariovistus had not fought a decisive battle, he learned that the Germans had a custom where their matrons would decide by lots and prophecies whether or not it was advantageous to engage in battle. They had declared that it was not fated for the Germans to win if they fought before the new moon. The next day, Caesar left a suitable garrison in both camps and drew up all the auxiliaries in front of the smaller camp for the enemy to see, using the auxiliaries to give the appearance of greater numbers since he was outnumbered by the enemy. He himself led his army in 3 lines to the enemy camp. The Germans had no choice but to bring out their troops and draw them up in tribal units, evenly spaced: the Herudes, Marcomanni, Triboci, Vangians, Nemets, Seduzzi, and Suebi, surrounding their entire line with wagons and carts to leave no hope of escape. They placed their women on these wagons, who, with outstretched hands and tears, begged the soldiers not to hand them over to Roman slavery. Caesar appointed a legate and a quaestor to each legion, ensuring they had witnesses to their valor. He himself began the battle from the right wing, which he perceived as the weakest part of the enemy line. Our men made a fierce attack on the enemy when the signal was given, and the enemy quickly charged, leaving no room for throwing javelins. So they abandoned their javelins and fought with swords at close quarters. The Germans quickly formed a phalanx and withstood the attack of the swords. Several of our soldiers leaped onto the phalanx, grabbed the enemy's shields with their hands, and wounded them from above. When the enemy line was pushed back and put to flight from the left wing, they still pressed heavily against our line on the right with their superior numbers. Publius Crassus, A young man commanding the cavalry noticed this, and being more agile than those engaged in the line, sent the third line to assist our struggling troops. Thus, the battle was restored, and all the enemies turned and fled, not stopping until they reached the Rhine, about 50 miles from the battlefield. Very few, trusting in their strength, tried to swim across or found rafts and saved themselves. Among these was Ariovistus, who found a small boat tied to the riverbank and escaped in it. Our cavalry pursued and killed the rest. Ariovistus had 2 wives, one a Suebian, whom he had brought from home, and the other a Norican, the sister of King Voccio, whom he had married in Gaul. Both died in the flight. He also had 2 daughters, one of whom was killed, and the other captured. Gaius Valerius Procillus, while being dragged by his guards in chains during the flight, encountered Caesar himself as he was pursuing the enemy with his cavalry. This event brought Caesar as much joy as the victory itself, seeing this honorable man of the province of Gaul, his friend and guest, rescued from the enemy and restored to him. Fortune had not diminished his joy and gratitude in this matter. Procillus said that 3 times in his presence, lots were cast to decide whether he would be immediately burned alive or spared for another time. The lots had spared him. Marcus Medius was also found and brought back to Caesar. With news of this battle being reported across the Rhine, the Suebi, who had come to the banks of the Rhine, began to return home. When those who lived nearest to the Rhine sensed that they were terrified, they pursued them and killed a great number of them. Caesar, having completed 2 major wars in one summer, led his army into winter quarters among the Sequani a little earlier than the season required. He put Labienus in charge of the winter quarters and then set out for Cisalpine Gaul to hold court sessions.